Well, who knows exactly and for sure? But if you start flipping through the rap sheets, literally the criminal history of some of the people associated with this president and his campaign, you may get pretty close to a story that explains it. Elliot Broidy was a top fundraiser for Donald Trump during the campaign. He was then named Deputy Finance Chair of the National Republican Party after Trump became the party's nominee for president. Elliot Broidy also narrowly avoided prison time when he became a cooperating witness back in the day after he was caught paying an elaborate and brazen series of bribes to financial regulators in New York State, along with their family members and their mistresses in the Trump era. That's sort of a record. At the Trump inaugural festivities, Elliot Broidy, of course, was there. And at the inauguration, he reportedly hooked up with another Trump-connected ex-con, who the New York Times reports would go on to take frequent meetings. The New York Times reports had taken frequent meetings throughout the campaign with Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and Mike Flynn after the inauguration during the first year of the Trump administration. This guy was also reported to have spent lots of time at the Trump White House, including multiple visits to Steve Bannon's office just off the Oval. His name was George Nader. And his criminal history included multiple convictions for child pornography and child molestation in 2 countries, resulting in at least 2 prison sentences. So when Elliot Broidy, the guy who had narrowly avoided prison in the New York State bribery scheme, and George Nader, the multiply convicted child pornography and child molestation guy, when they met up at the Trump inaugural, that was clearly a match made somewhere other than heaven. But they hit it off, and those 2 men, after meeting at the Trump inaugural, reportedly decided that they would go into a kind of business together. Because George Nader had long-standing connections to 2 Gulf monarchies, to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, those 2 countries quite near Qatar that we just showed on the map. Now, as for Elliot Broidy's business partner in that Qatar thing, well, as of today, he has a new and newly serious additional child pornography charge to contend with. Devlin Barrett and Rachel Weiner at the Washington Post were first to break the news today that George Nader has been indicted again on new child pornography charges stemming from an FBI search of his 3 iPhones at Dulles Airport in January of last year. These charges, we now know, have been pending against Nader for months, but apparently he's been out of the country and therefore out of the reach of U.S. federal law enforcement, despite this sealed criminal complaint against him and a sealed warrant for his arrest that were filed with the court last April. He fell back into the clutches of U.S. law enforcement today when he re-entered the country. He flew into JFK Airport in the New York City area, reportedly to seek medical treatment. Upon landing at the airport, he was arrested and taken into custody. Today, in 1985, he was charged with importing child pornography into the United States. He ultimately had that charge dismissed on a technicality. A few years later, in 1991, he was again charged with importing child pornography from overseas. In that case, he was convicted. He was given a 6-month sentence. Years later, in 2003, he was sentenced again, this time in the Czech Republic, this time not for child pornography, but for child molestation. That conviction also resulted in a prison sentence in the Czech Republic. Despite that extensive record, though, George Nader did become some kind of advisor to the government of the United Arab Emirates and the government of Saudi Arabia. And he did then attach himself like a barnacle to the Trump campaign and the Trump White House, where he really made himself one of the guys. He was apparently around a lot. In August 2016, during the presidential campaign, George Nader organized a meeting at Trump Tower, which ultimately became the subject of this blockbuster report in the New York Times this time last year. At the Trump Tower meeting were George Nader, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Prince, and a man named Joel Zamel, who was reportedly offering at that meeting an off-the-shelf foreign election interference effort that would be run by Mr. Zamel's Israeli company and would be financed by some of these Gulf monarchies that Mr. Nader worked for.